Hi everyone, welcome to this latest edition of the Guardians of the Flame podcast. This was an amazing privilege for me to interview Bruce Cockburn. He's, I'd say, one of the most important singer-songwriters in the world today. His first album was released in 1970. He's still making music to this day. He's an amazing singer-songwriter who has always captured the reality of the world we live in. He writes about faith, he writes about justice, he writes about love and loss and all the gamut, the range of human emotion and human experience. So many of you watching this will have heard of Bruce Cockburn. Some of you, if you haven't, I encourage you to go find his music. He's brilliant, and we really appreciated his generosity in letting us film this. Just to say, it was done very lo-fi, not to our usual standards, but the content's really good. In the middle of it, the Wi-Fi was dropped, and so he moved to a different house. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see him in a very different setting for the second half of the interview. And just want to say, we continue to really value your support on Patreon. Find Guardians of the Flame on Patreon. We really are looking for more and more people who stand alongside us to support our work, to produce quality podcasts and documentaries that really speak about reconciliation in a world of conflict. So support us, come alongside us, and we're looking forward to recording a new season of podcasts soon. So hope you enjoy this interview with the brilliant, great Bruce Cockburn. So I want to welcome everyone, if you're watching this, to this Guardians of the Flame episode of our podcast series. And it's a real privilege today to be interviewing a bit of a personal hero of mine, Bruce Cockburn. Many of you watching will have heard his music. Some of you may not have. If you haven't, I encourage you to check him out. He has, let me see, is it 34 albums? Something like that, into the 30s.
Something like that.
Since 1970. Bruce wrote a kind of an autobiography a couple of years ago, Rumors of Glory, and encourage you to check that out as well. And so Bruce Cockburn is I'm so thankful for you giving us the time. And on a San Francisco morning, where the sun is going down here in Northern Ireland, but it's I guess it's come up for you. Thanks for giving us your time.
Well, thanks for having me. It's nice to be able to spend the time with you.
Yeah. I wonder maybe just to start with the most recent activity you've been doing online, which was a concert you did, an online concert last week with 4 new songs. Can you just kind of tell us a little bit about those songs and, how did they get written? And are you planning another album anytime soon? Or?
Okay, that's a whole lot of questions.
Okay.
Yeah, just to clarify, it's not an album. It's a demo. It's just a video demo of the 4 new songs that I had at the time. There's another new one since we made that recording, but I gave it to Lighthouse to put out because as a fundraiser, because it seemed like a good idea. But from a selfish point of view, I just wanted to get the songs out there because I think they're kind of timely, or at least a couple of them are. And I wanted my voice to be heard saying the things those songs say at this time. And we're not ready to make a new album at this point. My general pattern has been to wait till I have enough songs and then go in the studio and do it. Some people don't operate that way. They'll do a song at a time, whatever. But I find I prefer to do everything at once and kind of give the album a sense of unity from song to song and sound, the overall sound and personnel and so on. So we're not ready for that yet. I need more songs, but I wanted to get these things out, as I said, because a couple of them, song called Orders and the song called Us All in particular, talk about the need to love, the instruction to love, or orders. Basically, the refrain of that is as I recall, our orders said to love them all. And basically that's the biblical, of course, take on things. And it's a take on things that a lot of people who consider themselves believers in the Bible or to be led by those teachings forget frequently that song out in particular to remind people and myself as much as anybody. I mean, it's when one writes a song, when I write a song, at least I'm talking to myself as much as anyone else. I often find out things about my own psyche from the writing process. The other song that seemed pertinent is Us All, and that's basically just a plea to recognize the things that we have in common, the scars that unite us. It's really there are so many things that we can look at that to separate ourselves from others, but one thing we all have in common is pain, and it's that's an area where we can find unity. Oh, look, you've been damaged this way, and me too. Or, I mean, you can take it anywhere you want, but that's the notion behind the song.
Yeah, no, those actually I really enjoyed all four of them, but those songs, those two in particular, really stood out. And I suppose especially with the theme of what we try and cover in these podcasts, which are kind of looking at voices of reconciliation and peace in a time of kind of heightened populism. And what is it from your vantage point on the West Coast of America? I mean, it might be stating the obvious, at the end of the Trump administration, but what is it that you feel makes those songs in particular so pertinent?
I have noticed, I mean, the United States is an interesting and peculiar place. And it has every country has its unique history, but the U.S. is and Canada too, to an extent, but it's more noticeable south of the border that that history that's only from the point of view of people of European extraction, at least, the history is only that deep, and I think the country. The culture is still trying to figure out who it is, how to be its own culture. I think in European countries that those discussions were settled a long time ago, although things don't really disappear. But in America, it's like people are still trying to figure it out. And who are we? What are we supposed to be doing in the world? And that. The various disputes, or rather the dispute, the multiple sides of that, what turns out to be a dispute over who America should be, were really forced apart by the Trump policies and a general encouragement during that period to hate each other, in effect. That encouragement took root. I mean, it worked quite well. So it became, you start hearing the word Democrat as a cuss word almost. And for me, Republican. I mean, I don't subscribe to either party. I'm not apolitical by any means, but I'm also not a citizen. I don't get to vote here. So I have a slightly distanced view of all these things. There are good arguments to be made on all sides of all the issues, but we don't mostly hear the good arguments. We mostly hear rhetoric, like cheap kind of rabble-rousing stuff, and or kind of thoughtless knee-jerk stuff. And so I'm actually kind of worried about the short-term future of the country. Long-term, I'm worried about the future of the world, but or at least the future of humanity in the world. The planet will still be here, but short-term, it's worrisome to see the fractiousness that's been been fed so well over the last few years.
Yeah. There was something I read in your book. I was just kind of going back over it before this interview, and I thought you said something that I actually kind of always picked up on by listening to your music. Is that you kind of described your music as separated into decades, and the 70s being more introspective, and I suppose maybe more about nature and kind of Lord of the Starfields, or going to the country, and then the 80s more externally focused. And you described it in your book. I could look up the quote, but as kind of more, you felt like you were obeying your orders, if you like. You were kind of looking outwards to the world. But that, ironically, as you were kind of doing what your Christian faith kind of was calling you to do, it actually led you away from more mainstream Christianity. I know we're going back in time, but almost that story sounds very similar to what many people are going through today. There are many people leaving traditional religious kind of churches, but they probably aren't leaving a desire for justice. In fact, they're probably more awakened by justice or environmental rights than ever before. I don't know if you want to kind of touch on what that is.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, for me, it was a very personal thing. I grew up with a kind of inward directed view, and that persisted into my early adulthood. But I think you hear it in the songs, as you said. If you listen to the songs from the 70s, I mean, this was not intentional that it broke down into decades like that. It's circumstantial, quote unquote, but I mean, it wasn't a plan of mine. But the 70s were characterized by a lot of time spent in nature, and that's reflected in the songs, and a lot of sort of inward spiritual, I can't call it searching exactly, it wasn't that deliberate, but a developing inward awareness, I guess I could say. But it became evident, partly from external circumstances, getting divorced, a bunch of other sort of major changes in my life at the end of the 70s. I began to understand, okay, well, you've got this far in your relationship with God. To go further, you need to find out who your neighbor is in order to love your neighbor properly. So I was moved toward a more social setting, an urban setting. In this case, it was Toronto. And I had lived in Toronto for short periods before and knew the city fairly well, but I'd never embraced it. And it was time to embrace it. And I did. I had a lot of fun, and some things that were not so much fun happened. And what I didn't find in there was a church that I could embrace, or that felt like it would embrace me. I had that in Ottawa, where I grew up and where I had lived most of the time previous to that. But I never found that in Toronto. So I gradually drifted away from thinking of myself as a churchgoer, and eventually, through a lot of reading and other things, and and also the politics, particularly in the States, from thinking of myself as a Christian, because Christianity was being more and more associated with what we see now as in what we're calling the evangelical community. I'm not sure that's quite a fair name, but that's what the journalists are calling it. That there's this association of Christian faith with a whole lot of political positions that I don't subscribe to, that's for sure, and a lot of people don't. And I remember having a conversation, this might have been in the book too, I don't remember, but with T-Bone Burnett in the early 90s, when we were working on an album together. And T-Bone said, it might be time for us Christians to stop calling ourselves Christians, because the people that are calling themselves Christians are doing these horrible things. They're promoting these things we don't, we don't subscribe to at all. And so maybe we should just find something else to call ourselves, or in my case, it just sort of felt unnecessary to call myself anything. I've always been interested in a relationship with God, and that has not abated at all. And I'm back to calling myself a Christian again in this decade, thanks to thanks to being led to a church that did embrace me from the moment I walked in. And it's been decades since I thought of myself as a churchgoer, but there I was. And so, I still have issues with some of it, with some of the things that I read in the Bible, and I have issues with some of the things that my fellow Christians, some of the positions that they take. But I think that the necessary spirit to approach things with is one of a willingness to disagree and share and to communicate, and without judgment, without recoiling in horror from, oh no, I can't do that, or from suggestions that, obviously some of these issues are very sensitive ones for people. Abortion, for example. And I mean, I've an acquaintance who's a gynecologist in Oregon, and she can't say the word abortion in the community she lives in because someone will shoot her. I mean, it's almost a given. And there are pockets in the country like that, some of them quite large pockets. Other places, nobody thinks twice about it. Or at least the people I meet don't think twice about it. But this is an example of the kind of divisions that exist, and the bridge, the gaps that need bridging. No matter what you think about the issues themselves, I mean, the important thing is to hold an attitude of mutual respect and of love, if you can make it. So sometimes a tall order, but that's the ideal.
I've heard it said it's not so much about what we believe, but how we believe those beliefs. How we hold beliefs. Do we hold them as fundamentals that kind of divide, or are we open to others in different ways? It kind of reminds me of a lyric of yours, which just came to me earlier. I can't remember what song it is. A big round planet in a big universe. Sometimes it looks blessed, sometimes it looks cursed. Depends what you look at. Obviously, even more, it depends on the way that you see. So the way that we see, the way that we kind of exhibit our life, maybe it's more than just the actual what's.
I think so. And I think that without some kind of interior work, we'll grow up with a set of attitudes that we were handed, and a kind of a set of kind of inherited triggers for various feelings and various ways of expressing those feelings that needs examining, because very often those things, we assume that this is just how we are and how the world is, but it isn't that way often. It's very often that we're acting out of a very subjective view. We find other people doing the same thing, motivated by their inherited rage or their inherited fear, or their inherited or inculcated sense of how things ought to be that has nothing. I mean, they may be couched in terms of religious faith, but often is, but it has nothing to do with the essence of the faith. It's just how people have socialized themselves for a long time. And we got to get past that. You got to, if you want a relationship with God, you've got to get past that, because although God is open and forgiving and all embracing, and will take anybody in any condition, I think, if you want to know what that relationship is, if you want to be an active participant in that relationship, then you have to do the same thing you would in any other relationship. You've got to pursue it. You've got to show up. You've got to be aware of the effects of your those unthought impulses that you were trained to have as a child. So, you know, and I doubt that society will ever get to a point where everybody's doing that. But I think most of we have to try. If you know that, you have to try. And it in there somewhere is included the ability to accept that others either have not gone through that process and should, or, well, not for me to say what should happen, but I feel like that. But you got to be charitable to people, because you don't know what they grew up with. You don't know. And I mean, it gets very dangerous when people assume that they agree and form a kind of tribe with a religious banner floating over it, you know. And like that has happened a lot in the US. That's what we're calling the evangelical community kind of has done in their support of Trump and their willingness to go along with his promotion of divisiveness. You know, I mean, a cliche to sort of cite about this, and it only has the value that any cliche does. I mean, is that the same people who are promoting the banning of abortion are promoting the use of capital punishment. You know, well, what's that? Because you save them at one end and kill them at the other end. Like that's BS. You know, I mean, it's unthought acting out. And if you get enough people that are all unthought and acting out in the same room, rubbing elbows together, then it becomes a social force, and that's the problem that we currently have, or a part of the problem.
Yeah. Kind of going back in time again, we're talking about our current day polarization, I suppose. And I'm speaking to you right from the Irish border, where about 3 days ago, it was 100 years since Ireland was partitioned for the first time. So I'm speaking from Rostrevor. We look out over Carlingford Lough on the Irish Republic. And so kind of conflict is very much something I grew up with once I moved here as a kid from New Zealand. And a lot of your songs over the years have dealt with conflict, not so much, well, more recent times we have the modern day polarization in America, but in the 80s, you talked a lot about Central America, especially. And of course, one of your, I suppose one of your most well-known songs was If I Had a Rocket Launcher. I remember driving in the car a couple of years ago with an American pastor. He's a great guy. He's a big fan of yours, Brian Zond. He's pastor of a church in Missouri. And he said, if I had a rocket launcher is an imprecatory psalm. And he was referring to these psalms of the Bible, which are kind of where the psalmist, wants God to rain down judgment on his enemies. But of course, they're not meant to be read as the will of God as such. They're meant to, be a human expression of him at that particular moment. I thought that was an interesting comment. I wonder, just because that's a well-known song, and I don't know if I'm going to get to interview you ever again, I'd love to hear just some reflections on that song and Guatemala, and obviously, what was your thought process in the writing of it? And
you just, so you've kind of frozen and your voice is cutting out a little bit there. But if you can hear me,
I can hear you.
I can't
okay.
tell because, okay, good. Then I'll keep going. So,
it's freezing here. Let's see. Sorry. Sorry, Bruce, we can't hear you there. You're muted. Let's see. Still mute. Yeah. He said I was cutting in and out. Should I stop my video and start it again?
Hold on, there we
Oh,
go. Got me now?
Yeah, you're. Could you turn?
Are you hearing me now?
Yeah, I am. Could you just turn the phone back and sideways again, and then go back the other way again and see if it? There you go.
There we go.
Yeah. Sorry.
It looks good to me.
Yeah, I think it's fine from our end. I don't know how.
It's got to be that Chinese rocket getting in the way.
yeah. But don't worry, we'll edit all this stuff out. So that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I know you can do that. So okay, so if I had a rocket launcher, I got that you were invited me to talk about that song.
Yeah.
It was written. I started writing it immediately upon leaving a refugee camp in the south of Mexico. It was an unofficial refugee camp because Mexico at the time was not permitting the UN or anybody else to set up refugee camps, even though at the time there were about 150,000 refugees from Guatemala in the south of Mexico who had fled the incredible violence that was being inflicted on the people in the countryside there. And they're entirely, the population was all Mayan people, native people, who are, I shouldn't say are in the present tense. I don't really know how it is in Guatemala right now, but at the time, certainly they were discriminated against by the population that considered itself more European. There was, it's just the levels of brutality were unbelievable. And the stories we were hearing from the refugees were heartbreaking and outrageous. And in that sense of outrage, I started writing, if I had a
sorry, Bruce, we've just lost you there, I think. Sure. Could you kind of just reflect a little bit on it and observing a conflict zone and even that lyric, if I had a rocket launcher, it sounds like those psalmists in the imprecatory psalms, as my friend Brian Zond, referred to it, it was expressing something deep within you about the injustice of what you were watching. Can we kind of go back and revisit that song?
Yes. Yeah, but by all means. Yeah, I think actually it's nice to hear it described in those terms because a lot of people didn't hear it that way. But the one thing that it was certainly not intended to be was an incitement to anyone to go and shoot Guatemalan soldiers. I mean, that even though some of them had it coming, it was not about that. I mean, and oddly, and I think this is partly just a kind of cultural thing. The refugees, the Guatemalan refugees, among whom I had spent a few days in a couple of informal camps in the very south of Mexico, near the border with Guatemala, were telling these terrible stories of the things they had fled from. Truly disgusting stuff, and there was this mixture of pathos and outrage that went with those stories, but the people themselves told them in a very flat, kind of unemotional way. It was like, yeah, well, this happened, and this happened, and the things they're describing are things you're going like they're stuff that the most perverted slasher movie can barely keep up with. And so, there I'm sitting listening to this stuff, and I felt the rage bubbling up in me on their behalf, which is something that there was a lesson in there too that's kind of not mentioned in the song. But after I left those camps, I was sitting in this little Mexican town in a hotel, and I started. I was so kind of traumatized myself by just hearing about these things. Never mind having lived through them, and being very aware of the likelihood that those things were continuing, and that they might continue to be inflicted on the same people, because even though they're in Mexico, the Guatemalan army was staging raids into the camps, looking for whoever they thought was, a supporter of the rebel cause in Guatemala, in the civil war that was going on at the time. So, there I am sitting there, and I started writing down how I felt, hearing the Guatemalan helicopter patrolling the border, while hearing these stories. And the border was only a few hundred meters away. I wanted to shoot that thing down. I thought the people who were perpetrating these things had no claim to life or humanity. And I don't believe that, but that's how I felt. And I wrote the song, and then after I wrote it, I thought I can never sing this for anyone. I mean, this is, I can't sing a song like this. But I did sing it for somebody, and they raved over it, and they got all excited, and then whatever, one thing led to another. But what I wanted, when I did decide, okay, I'm going to put this out, I put it out because I wanted people, my peers, to understand how easy it is to feel like that, and that they should not sit in judgment over people who chose to take up arms because they felt like they had no other choice. And that's what the situation in Guatemala was. You can argue with whether that was the best response to what was going on or not. And then you could have, lots of things to say about that. But people who sit around watching their children die because medical treatment is withheld from them by the system, not by anybody like deciding, okay, you can't have a doctor, but just the way the whole social system was set up. And then when they object to that, they're killed, often in horrendous ways. And so after a while, you have a generation or two like that, and finally somebody says, screw this, I'm going to shoot somebody. And they get a gun, and they start an army, and then you have a civil war. And it's a terrible outcome, a terrible process. Everything about it is terrible. Surely there could have been some intervention beforehand that allowed the people in control of the country to think more progressively or think more charitably about the people that they regarded as second-class citizens. It just it sort of staggers the imagination. But the stories, some of the stories were unique to my experience of that place. But a lot of the stuff that the people were describing was stuff that you heard the same stories from Rwanda. You heard the same stories from Cambodia. You heard there's that kind of evil kind of lacks imagination. It's like, oh yeah, let's just herd all the people into the church and set it on fire. That'll work, And this kind of activity is replicated all over the world. And so, okay, so it isn't just about Guatemala. It's about people. It's about human behavior. You can find it in the Bible, in the Old Testament. The Old Testament is full of terrible stories like that. We went into the town and we massacred all the men and we took the women for ourselves. Whoopee! God made it. God let us do this and gave us strong backup. We're like God's SWAT team, these terrible things done in the name of their faith, which really are not about the faith at all. They're about power, about insecurity, about all sorts of kind of the toxic aspects of the human psyche. So, you know, the song was just really an attempt to expose some of that to people who were maybe prone to sitting around thinking, oh, geez, you know, they shouldn't be doing that. Well, what would you do, you know, in a situation like that? I had no intention of shooting anyone, and nor do I now. You know, I mean, long after that, I kind of learned how to do it, but it doesn't take much skill really to. It just takes the will and the equipment. But in any case, that's kind of the background of the song. And I remember, I think I said this in the book, I just remember sitting in this hotel room and crying and drinking half a bottle of whiskey and starting to write the song. I didn't finish until I got back to Toronto, but it took shape in that hotel room in Mexico when the feelings were extremely raw and fresh.
Yeah. That was, I think it was one of the first of your songs I ever heard. I had heard of you in the late 80s, and then in the mid 90s, I was at university in Belfast, and a friend of mine gave me a mixtape of your songs, and including an acoustic version of that song, and I'd never heard anything like it. And then afterwards, that was a friend of mine, Dave Hines. He gave me Charity of Night, and I'd say it changed my life. It probably one of my favorite albums of all time. My wife and we love that album. But I just wonder, just because of this podcast series, we're dealing with a lot of violence, conflict, reconciliation, and particularly looking at places where violence has been, where religion has been used to kind of justify the use of violence. And, you know, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, he said this, that I quoted most of these podcasts: religion is like fire, it warms, but it also burns, and we're the guardians of the flame. And it seems to me like you've touched on that. I read in your song, is it Justice? You know, about Jesus, Buddha, you know, Islam, you know. Even
everybody wants to see justice. Everybody wants to see justice done on somebody else.
That's right.
It's which is kind of, it's a bit glib, but it's addressing that same thing. It's the rabbinical tradition is so rich with these pithy little sayings that just cut right to the heart of the matter. And you know, if we could just listen to these things and absorb them, I mean, that's as much a part of the human psyche as the willingness to inflict violence. That the capacity is in us to think past the immediate things, to take a broader view. Sometimes that becomes very difficult. I mean, if we're attacked by someone, it's hard to sort of stand above that and kind of watch it happening and explain it to yourself while it's happening. You have to respond either by running away or fighting back. Running away at least allows you perhaps a bit of breathing space where you can actually maybe think about it more deeply. But it's, you know, the only real solution, and it's one that I don't think there'll ever be a finish to this, but we have to try to head it off. You have to address people's grievances and encourage. We have to encourage in each other a willingness to listen and to try to sort out the problems we have in the most friendly way that we can manage. And that process will never stop. You'll never get to the end where you can say, okay, we can stop working on this now, because it's in our nature to fight. You know, we're both prey and predators by genetics, and you know, and the fight or flight thing is strong in us, and so how do you temper the extremes of that with with reason? I mean, when everything's comfortable, we can do it. People, who are comfortable and well fed and materially okay, are generally willing to listen to each other. But the minute, it doesn't take much of a spark to start the wrong kind of spiritual flame. And the fact that people use religion as an excuse, I mean, it is just an excuse. It doesn't matter what kind of Christian you are. I mean, Jesus, it doesn't care what kind of Christian you are. He cares whether you care about him or not. That matters. But how you express that caring, that interest, it shouldn't make any difference. I mean, okay, if you do it, if you think that you have to sacrifice babies to honor Jesus, well, maybe somebody has to stop that. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about minor differences in belief, really. Which church leader do we listen to? And that kind of dispute, and it's really senseless, and it's transparently not about religion. It's about tribalism, with religion as an excuse. Sometimes the religious leaders encourage that and inculcate that in us, but then those are leaders that we hope few people listen to. but we know from practice that that's not always the case.
Yeah. We're kind of touching for a bit there on your songwriting that focused externally and in places of conflict. But we kind of started this interview talking about the even faith, and you kind of reference kind of journeys in your own life of kind of not sure about where you stood with faith and where you are now. But I wonder if we kind of come back to the faith side, because it's all wrapped up in together. A friend of mine, the friend who gave me the first ever album of yours, Charity of Night, Dave Hines, Dave and Jill, Dave said to me, I said to him, do you want to ask Bruce a question? So he sent me about 10 of them. One of them was to ask you how you spent your fall vacation. But we won't.
I've had a whole year of vacation thanks to COVID, as have we all.
Yeah. That's one of his favorite songs. But the song he wrote, the song he wrote, the question he asked was, do you consider your kind of maybe returning to faith as like a homecoming, a prodigal's return, or an evolution into something different? Struck me, maybe I'll leave it at that and let you kind of, is it a kind of a homecoming, or is it an evolution into something more rich, maybe?
I think it's both. I think that it's an unfolding process that I also don't really see an end to. But certainly I feel like the big moves in my life, especially with hindsight, but once in a while I've sort of caught it on the fly. Those big moves are that it's God's finger nudging things this way or that, and finding my way back to a church that has allowed me to think. I mean, I went to my first conversations with the people at San Francisco Lighthouse. I said, I don't know what I believe. I had read a book by a Canadian clergyman called, I forget his name right now, but the book is called The Pagan Christ. And in it, he compares the story of Jesus to the story of the Egyptian deity Horus, who and those stories predate the story of Jesus by a couple of thousand or maybe 3,000 years. And Horus is born of a virgin, has 12 followers, is killed, comes back to life, and so you realize that the elements of the story are in the human psyche too, right? Whether you believe the story is literally true or not. I began to question the reality of Jesus, the historical reality, not the spiritual presence particularly, but reading that book and thinking about things and uh, other aspects of it as well. It just had become, and my distance from any kind of Christian community had sort of put me in this very uncertain state. So I go back to this church. I was led back to Lighthouse, start going there. People were totally accepting. It's like, okay, well, whatever, just keep coming. We love you. We're glad to have you, and nobody knew who I was. It wasn't like, oh, hey, Cockburn's showing up at our church. They didn't have a clue. And so it was really just this incredibly welcoming atmosphere. And I thought, okay, here's a tribe I could cheerfully join, but we don't want to think in terms of tribes. So the community aspect of it is certainly pleasurable, but what counts more is that in the repeated acts of worship, I've been led back to a sense of the reality of Jesus. In a way, I mean, through a kind of vision or through just the focus repeatedly. And I've been doing dream work for a long time, sort of loosely based on Jung's stuff, and that has been part of one of the instruments that God's used to kind of keep me moving where I need to go. And so it's an unfolding thing. Right now I feel that my relationship with God is the thing that matters most in my life, and not to the exclusion of a lot of other important things, but it's number one. And that's been true before in my life, but it is again. So I'm kind of grateful for that, and it's, I think, showing up in the songs as well, in the newer songs.
Yeah. It's just so good to hear your story. Again, in that song I quoted earlier from Child of the Wind, there's roads of the earth, roads of the spirit, the best roads of all of the ones that aren't certain. And it's this kind of certainty is what I think maybe a lot of people of faith sometimes cling to, and it can maybe lead to a bit of fundamentalism, but you've managed to keep this kind of generosity of heart. You've got strong faith, but you're also not, you're not claiming certainty, maybe. Is that right, do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, strong faith, I'm not so sure, but I'm not claiming certainty. I have some faith, and I would like it to be stronger, but I also think that the absence of it is instructive too, and that really, for me, what I long for is for God to be constantly with me in my awareness, and He's not. He's not, because my own garbage gets in the way, or because it's just too easy to not think about those things in the moment, depending on the things that are going on around you. And it's easy to get sucked into false beliefs. And I think that's true whether you have faith or not. I mean, you can, as you said, sometimes these things harden into a kind of like the wall of Jericho, around yourself.
Calcify,
and I mean, that wall has to come down, or you have to get through it somehow, and allow what's outside to come in, because it's like any relationship. I mean, I'm very poor at remembering people's names, but there was a book I read by a rabbi, and I believe the book was called God is a Verb. And I think it may be that, I can't really remember now, it's a long time ago, but it may be that the actual Hebrew way of referring to God is a verb. I'm not sure technically, but in any case, the point is God is in motion, and the energy of God is in motion, and it's in us, and as much as it's in everything else. And so this is in one of the songs somewhere too. See, if we talk long enough, I'll quote myself over and over and over again. But it's like everything is motion to the motion be true, and that's, you got to be. My thumb is getting tired holding the phone here. You've got to be just be constantly open, because God is constantly showing us things and constantly taking us places. And to be receptive to that means to have us to be tied up in as little prior assumptions or as few prior assumptions rather as possible.
Well, I would love to talk for a long time about your music, but we'll have to. I think we should bring it to an end for now. But maybe I'll just ask you in closing just a couple of musical questions.
Sure.
Are you planning? I mean, if the pandemic does come to an end soon, are you planning to go on the road again? Any chance of you coming back to Ireland?
It's everything's up in the air, of course, but certainly the intention is to get out and play shows for people. I mean, I really miss that, and it's when the songs are their most complete, when there's that loop between me and the listener, and the song is a vehicle for some sort of mutual sharing of space and time. I really miss that. And so, yeah, we'll make another album, hopefully, which will include these new songs, and we'll, and they'll be touring. So that's the hope.
Yeah.
How far afield it will go depends on, well, I mean, I'm 75, almost 76. I'm not sure how much I've got left to give it, but right now I feel like I really want to get out there and do it.
I'd say you've only got about 25 or 30 years to go, so
yeah, sounds good to me.
That's only about 15 more albums, Bruce. So,
yeah. So I better get at it.
Yeah. Well, I just, my reflection in closing is that it feels like your music, obviously it spans now 5 decades, but it's as relevant as it's ever been. And I'm reflecting on, again, another one of your most well-known songs, "Lovers in a Dangerous Time." We sit here 100 years after Ireland was partitioned, at a time of Brexit, a time of a week ago there were big riots in Belfast, and around the world. Obviously, there's this polarizing, moving to the extremes, and it seems like we need more people like you who can show us how to kick in the darkness till it bleeds daylight.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, we need to resist that polarization to whatever degree is possible for each of us. That's the call right now, because it's an evil that's sweeping the world, I think, and it's all ego, it's all playing on people's fears. It's all about power, and that it's a power that's not the power that God has to offer, or that God will display when He feels like it. It's a cheap imitation of that political power. Who cares? I mean, just run the darn country and stay off my back. But obviously, it's not quite that simple, and we do have to pay attention, because there are a lot of things being done in our name as citizens of whatever country we belong to, that we can't countenance. So we just have to not get into the us and them attitude any more than we can help.
Well, I think we'll leave it there for this podcast officially. But I just want to thank you, Bruce, for your time, and certainly love to have you over here again. And I know there's a lot of musicians in this area that would love to play with you, and we'd love to. We run a big center here. We'd love to have you here sometime if the winds ever blow you over this way again, or if we can figure out a way figure out a way to make it happen.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah. So, well, thanks, Bruce Cockburn, and maybe in sometime in the future we'll get to chat face to face in a different form. So,
yeah, we'll hope for that too. Thank you, Johnny. I appreciate it.
Yeah.